Okay, I think we're done now. Right, let's get going then. Thank you everybody for joining this playback session, and thanks for being punctual. As you know, we're going through a series of these briefings this week, and there'll be a kind of a final kind of drop-in session next week for anybody that still wants to ask questions. So the intention of these is less a presentation and more opportunity for Q&A. It's only an hour, so we'll crack on through some kind of basic slides which set the scene. And then we'll get to Q&A as quickly as we're able to. So essentially, we just want to make sure that people are on the same page with regards to what the plan is and it's not before we get into the Q&A phase. So if we could move on to the first main slide. Thank you. Okay. Right, so just as an overall kind of summary, it was always intended to reset the program plan once the core capability providers were all in place and the design was baselined. So we are at that point. Since the decision document in August 21, there have been quite significant changes, and we just wanted to outline what most of those changes are, because they do have significant impact in relation to changing the plan from the original timetable to the replan that's being proposed. So the biggest changes in approach are, in summary, the participants can proceed at the pace of their choosing. So the earliest aren't held back, but there are options. And this has been a very significant change, which effectively impacts all activities in the plan and obviously creates a phased approach to delivery. The SIT strategy itself has been quite significantly changed more recently to act to preserve the M9 milestone, but also get the program moving into the next phase expeditiously. So that obviously is a quite notable change. And we've allowed for staggering of entry into the component integration testing, the first part of SIT, most notably to accommodate MPRS during that 4-month CIT window. But I think we've been very clear in more recent times as to when people need to be coming into component integration testing, which is a key element of the plan. There are other things in the plan that have become clearer on equivalence. Participants involved in SIT, the basic assumption is that they will not have to undertake qualification testing, although they'll still have to do their qualification assessment document and any DBT2 for system process changes that won't be tested in SIT or qualification testing. But that's become much clearer now, and there is still an assumption around equivalence, but that is the aim, and we're working carefully with code delivery bodies to make sure that that assumption turns into kind of confirmation once we've got those qualification approaches in place. And equivalence isn't intended to produce additional risk because the code delivery bodies will be independently reviewing and cross-checking SIT tests with the qualification tests to ensure that the risk is managed from an enduring operational perspective. On equivalence, therefore, there is the assumption there's equivalence, and we will be working with the code bodies to kind of work alongside that, and that's the assumption you should use based on any impact assessment you provide to us, CR 22. We are placing reliance. There is a placing reliance policy out for final conclusion this month. So non-SIT participants may, where appropriate, place reliance on MHHS testing done earlier by other participants, and this policy will go to TMAG this month and subsequently to the code bodies PABs. For qualification, as another way of phasing the delivery, we have in qualification 7 tranches, accepting the LDSOs who will carry out their qualification testing a bit earlier. But non-SIT participants have, after completing their PIT activities, they have the option to go through a number of different tranches in qualification testing. And migration itself is also phased, and we'll start with participants who complete SIT, and thereafter will essentially mirror the phased nature of qualification delivery. And the other big change that everybody knows is the fact that we agreed at the end of last year to follow a reverse migration option, and that allows SIT and qualification to run over an extended period without prejudicing consumer choice. So quite significant changes since the original timetable was published in 2021. And of course, we've got the interim plan in the meantime, but what we don't want to be doing is continuing with that interim plan much longer. And therefore, I think everybody agrees it would be better to baseline the plan as soon as possible now, rather than wait for other uncertainties to become more clear. So round 3 success was that we got good rate of input. A lot of the participants responded. We got good insights, and this plan is basically, with some exceptions, the round 3 timeline, with a few variations. But basically, because of the input we got back from participants in round 3, we were able to have more confidence that essentially the round 3 timeline was viable, with some variations, which we'll cover. And just to reinforce, we said in in the last calendar quarter, in other words, January, February, March, that the plan should be led by what's going on in the governance groups, the working groups, the advisory groups. So therefore, the plan, since the round 3 publication of that plan, we have been following SME consensus across working groups and advisory groups, and the plan is much more led by those discussions and decisions. And where decisions haven't yet been made, we've tried to follow the assumptions based on those conversations. So it's very much more governance led since round 3, which is what we promised it would be. And that's the way in which we've ensured that we get maximum industry buy-in to the plan. Fundamentally, MVC for SIT is a key assumption, and we believe that we're going to get a reasonable constitution of the MVC based on feedback that we have now. And more generally, just to kind of set expectations, the plan is live. It will be subject to controlled change once it's been baselined, and as we drive to manage the risk in the delivery, that's normal. So we're not saying there won't be CRs after the plan's been baselined. There probably will be, and potentially even sooner rather than later. But it is important to get the plan rebaselined, say, and the plan has tried to acknowledge risk, which is why in some places we have date ranges now rather than absolute dates for key milestones. So what we're saying is, let's rebaseline the plan. Let's acknowledge there's still things to be answered at this point, but there always will be. And let's not assume that this plan will be cast in stone for the next X months, because that's not the way programs generally work. Right, we move on, Becca, to the next slide. So this is essentially just a way of showing how the plan has evolved since the CR9. Through round 3 and to what we now have, which is CR22, which you're currently working to impact assess. It shows that largely the plan is per round 3, although there are date ranges around M10, and therefore we've also suggested that if there's movement in M10, there will obviously be subsequent and consequent movement of later milestones. We've assumed that if M10 moves by X months, then the other key milestones move by the same amount. That in practicality might not be the case. We may be able to lessen the impact further down, but for purposes of assumptions and for the impact assessments, that's the way we've portrayed the plan. And we intend to reach M16 by December 26. But bearing in mind the milestone is quite a long way out and is potentially affected by the cumulative effect of all the delivery risks to the programme at that point. So, that's the way in which we've laid out the plan. But there is risk and there is a potential for change in it, and nobody's saying otherwise. There's a 2-month gap between M15 and M16. That's basically a stabilization period where we'll watch the system to check that operational metrics are right before passing the M16 milestone. And basically coming back to the top of the Gantt chart, we have extended a component integration testing by a couple of weeks to accommodate some of the MPRS delivery, and that's important. So we've got MPRS coming in at the start and at the end of CIT. It kind of bookends CIT, and that's the way in which we've been able to establish that the timeline is viable from a point of view of the core capability providers, including the MPRS provider. And we've revisited some assumptions around the regression testing period, which is why overall we've flexed the front end, but we haven't changed the back end at this point. But there is risk, obviously, but nobody really can determine how long we'll need for regression at this point. So we've made very clear our assumptions in that respect. We can move on to the next slide, please. So essentially a refresh of round 3. There's 3 critical paths in here as we portrayed last time. There's the actual critical path, the hard red line. There's a kind of heavy dotted red line, which is the critical path through the MVC, through SIT to migration to reach M10 and 11. And then there's also a critical path through the qualification activities. And we called out key risks here very briefly, because I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we've got obviously the risk that core capability providers are in place, and we'll be watching that very carefully. We've got to also monitor the composition of the MVC, because there is a risk that we don't have an MVC in place, and that would obviously impact timelines directly. There's a risk around test data readiness, and one of the biggest risks is that we are currently a little bit behind where we want to be in terms of identifying the approach and testing plans for data, but that's being recovered at this point, and there's a lot of artifacts and information coming through on test data. We have moved some of the milestones in line with the latest thinking, so there is a little bit more time for participants to provide their data for testing than was originally expected in round 3. There is a risk specifically around the sensitivity of dates for SIT functional and SIT migration testing. There's clearly a SIT migration timeline risk relating to the impact of the migration approach and the migration design, and on some migration related DBT activities, notably MPRS. And risk 5 is more to do with LDSOs all of them needing to qualify by M10 to ensure national coverage. So as per round 3, we've called out the non-SIT LDSO qualification testing separately because it is earlier than the other qualification activities. There are assumptions for the qualification testing duration in each tranche near the lower end of this plan. So 6 months for qualification activities and 2 months for governance for each tranche. There's obviously some risk that we may get in risk 7, some bunching towards the end of qualification. So for slower participants, we'll need to monitor that closely to make sure we don't have too many back-ended in the kind of later tranches of qualification. Risk 6 is that suppliers need their contracted parties to get through the delivery with them, and particularly if they haven't been through SIT and coming through qualification. So there's an ecosystem around suppliers of service providers that will be required for them to go into migration. So there's a risk there to be monitored and managed, and also suppliers in risk 8, suppliers with larger volumes of MPANs to migrate should be seeking to start migration sooner rather than later to ensure that the migration is complete within the allotted time. And in risk 10, we've basically modelled the scenarios, made assumptions, including from previous programs like faster switching. Basically, we're allowing 18 months to effect the migration. So we're assuming a couple of large suppliers in SIT, which would be around 5 to 10 million MPANs available to be migrated from April 25, possibly 12 months to do that. And it means another 20 odd million MPANs to be migrated after qualification, with that qualification being conducted via 7 tranches. So the first tranche will start migrating in September 25, with 12 months to complete that. And the last people will get through qualification by end of March 26. And we've assumed 6 months for them to complete that. So eventually getting to the end by the end of Q3 or early Q4 26. And M15, of course, needs 100% of MPANs migrated. Right, we can now move on. Very touch on just the key phases. So on the next slide. Okay, so the design assurance is, there's a new approach to design assurance, which was communicated by Dagan, a specific webinar last month. So it's important to engage all SIT participants as early as possible, and to gauge the areas of concern and to target those more deeply as we move towards SIT. But the initial questionnaire and questions will focus on the participants' designs and any related dependencies. We're not seeking to duplicate test assurance or delivery assurance activities. So the questions we will ask, we were aiming to only ask once. And obviously one of the benefits of volunteering for SIT is that you'll get the early engagement from the SI in responsive design assurance support. So we can identify with you potential risks in designs and, if you like, provide more support and more clarity for any questions that participants are asking. And on the next slide, which you'll be aware of, is the schedule. So core capability providers have already had their questionnaire for design assurance, and everybody else will get theirs on the 9th of May. It's not mandatory of that exercise from the 9th of May for participants who are not intending to be in sit, but obviously we are suggesting that the earlier you do it, the better, and we will revisit it for non-sit participants later in the year. Moving on, DBT, taking a while to come through, there we go. Okay, so it's previously been raised that DBT1 and DBT2 need to be clearly understood in the context of the plan. I think that material has been covered in working groups. So DBT1 is design, build and test activities required to enter into either sit or qualification testing, depending on the path that you want to take. And this is a program requirement and will be design and test assured by the program. DBT2 is systems and process changes delivered by participants that will not be tested in sit or qualification testing, but are needed for MHHS, such as consequential change. And this is an obligation of all participants, sit and non-sit, and will be assured by the code delivery bodies via the qualification activities. Moving on. On test data approach and plan, we recognise we've been a bit somewhat behind the curve in clarifying the programme's approach to test data ahead of testing, although we are devoting much more time and effort to moving this forward and making it clearer. So this is the latest approach and timeline, which was discussed at SIT working group last week and will be discussed at data working group later this month. And a key point to note there is our plan indicates that participants' data cuts need to be complete by 24th of August, which was later than the original plan of June. The plan is somewhat assumptions based at the moment, and we look forward to your impact assessment and in parallel your contributions to the working groups as we move to clarify this plan further. And the overarching test data and approach and plan is due next month. Moving on. Some of these slides are fairly familiar from round 3, with some slight variations, but just to be clear about a sit and the, as we say, the dependency on the minimum viable cohort, the point that by the 23rd of May, we will want to know for sure who's going to be in sit and who's not. And underpinning that, we are starting the fast track implementation group from tomorrow with those participants who have already declared that they intend to be in sit, and that group is still open to other volunteers for sit as we go through and towards the 23rd of May. Moving on, just to clarify, the objective sit to test the design and to verify the characteristics of the market interface and services in an integrated environment. And just to point out right at the bottom there that SIT participants are not expected to undergo additional qualification testing in the qualification phase. As I said earlier, that's the assumption that we're using, and that's what we're intending to be the case. Moving on, just to note that we do have uncertainty around the 170 and the impact of CR17, CR18 and so on. So changes may happen, and if they are agreed, they may impact on the plan for SIT functional testing and SIT migration testing, because each of those converge at the core systems code freeze. So if there is significant slippage in either SIT functional testing or SIT migration testing, it would affect the critical path and therefore impact the end dates for SIT. So this is something that, again, that we'll be watching closely as we go through the delivery. Moving quickly onwards, qualification. So there's various elements here. I think I've covered some of these already, but basically this is run by the code delivery bodies, and they will manage and control entry and exit from qualification through the monthly meeting cycle and the 7 tranches that we have in the plan. So the programme will be providing support to the code delivery bodies, but the actual management of the activities will be with the code delivery bodies. Moving on, regulatory. I think the only thing to say, I think people are familiar with this one. We just need to ensure the implementation date for applicable code changes, which is M8, is aligned to be by or before M10, as you would imagine. There's a schedule in there as well, which you would be familiar with. And on migration and transition, so the migration and transition work stream will produce all of the activities and deliverables required to prepare for and execute MPAN migration from M11 to M15, followed by the cutover at M16, and support the BSC and REC performance assurance teams. And there's some just clarification of language here about what migration and transition mean, because people do continually get confused about the difference. So migration, moving the servicing of MPANs from the current market roles to servicing them under the TOM services, and transition, the end-to-end process of getting from the current state to the target end state for the TOM. And I think the last slide, because then we can get into the Q&A, is just to identify the transition design approach, which you'll be becoming familiar with. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but if there are questions, please raise them. So we therefore have best part of 35 or so minutes for Q&A. The way we run this, and this is the main purpose of the session, is hands up, and we'll take them in order. And usually the first one to put their hand up is the icebreaker, and it sometimes takes a while. But we are here really to help you as you're now starting to look at your CR22 impact assessments. If there are questions that are starting to occur to you, this is a session where you can do that. I would also say that post this session, there's a drop-in session next week, which anybody can attend at any time during that session to ask questions. You can also ask for bilateral conversations with us, or you can just email the PMO box with questions in relation to the plan as they occur to you as you're producing your impact assessments. But this is really a catch-all. If there are burning questions or things that aren't clear to you based on having reviewed or done early reviews of the artifacts we sent out, then we can accommodate them here. So who's going to be first? I've got most of my team here ready to answer the questions that will make me look stupid. So please go ahead, Stephen.
Yep, I'll go first. So Stephen Lovell, I'm the program manager for the E.ON metering business. You mentioned obviously the cutoff has moved for the SITS volunteers to the 23rd of May. And that seems to make sense, but there's other references within the placing reliance document that talks about cut-off dates 20 working days preceding that. Is that correct? That basically if you want to be a SITS participant and others, and you want to place reliance on other parties, that basically it's actually the 21st of April still.
I knew Don was going to step in here. Go for it.
Hi, Stephen. Yeah, look, we recognise that that's quite a aggressive time period. What we would say is we'd encourage you to start a dialogue with us if you are intending to adopt the policy, so that we can understand how you're planning to adopt it, and sort of talk that through with you and get the code delivery bodies also bought into that. If you can start that process as soon as possible, that's great. We'd like to have some degree of certainty around that leading up to the 23rd. But we will continue to work with you beyond the 23rd if you're still pulling together your proposal. So we'll just mark it as subject to assurance following the 23rd of May. So there is some leeway there, is essentially the feedback. We've just not communicated that yet. We have had a number of participants say the same thing. So yeah, there is some flexibility.
And it's to give you as much time as possible, basically, but try and hit the deadlines.
The intention of the 20 days was that we want to know early on if your proposals are likely to be viable from our perspective. So 20 days before the 23rd, if we're starting that engagement, and we could quite quickly say whether there's a conversation to be had that will work for both of you and for us. It's really important to know that ahead of time. So if in that 20-day window, there may be further conversations on a proposal that looks like it might be viable, or we can have the conversation that it isn't viable for some reason, either needs to be modified or it won't work. So I think that was the intention of having that lead time into the 23rd, if I'm not wrong, Dom.
Yep.
Okay, understood. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen. And thanks for being first. It's always the hardest job.
Can I just add one point on that, Keith? Is one thing we are keen to see is obviously assurance that your delivery plan does align to our testing dates. So placing reliance aside, we would want to see that definitely.
And as I mentioned with the fast track implementation group, which is starting its meetings from tomorrow. And we are expecting everybody who wants to be part of that SIT community. As Dom says, all of you will have to demonstrate that your delivery plans align with the timetable in the plan under CR22, because if that's not the case, then it's a non-starter. So delivery planning and the progress and the refinement of those delivery plans is going to be a key criterion for establishing on the 23rd of May who will be in SIT and who won't be in SIT. It's not just a question of volunteering. It's a question of us being confident that proposals like the one Dom suggested are viable, but also that the delivery plans make sense to us and are sufficiently granular to give us confidence that you can actually be ready to get into SIT on time. I think we shocked everybody to silence, Dom. That's who's going to be next? It wouldn't be the first session where we don't get questions and people have just joined to see if there are other questions from others, and that's fine as well. But as I say, there are other ways you can contact us bilaterally if you don't want to pipe up in the kind of big group like this. We are really keen in the coming days to make sure that you have the information you need to do your impact assessments. We would like everybody to reply to CR22. That way we get a sense of whether the plan is as it needs to be. Because once we get to proposing to PSG and PSG proposing to Ofgem to sign this plan off, we've got to be really clear that we have industry buy-in to it and we're all going to commit to the delivery of this plan. So, you know, participants who don't reply to the impact assessment, that's not really helping us at this stage. So really, we want to give you the information you need, and we'll do it bilaterally. We'll do it by you know, email through the PMO box or whatever you want. And there is the drop-in session next week where it will be kept open, that session, all through that duration. You can pop in at whatever moment you want if something occurs to you. I recognise that many of you will only start to start reading those artifacts, so questions may come over the coming few days. We just wanted to front-end load these sessions to give you a sense of top-down what the plan is and why it is. So if there are no questions, maybe the initial explanation of the plan is sufficient for you at this point. Please do reach out. Stephen, go have another go.
Yeah, I'll have another go. Yeah. Just one question on the milestone contingency that you've got in place.
Yes.
So if contingency is used in M9 as an example, so pit exit moves to the right, do you have dependencies in your plan for SIT entry moving to the right as well? Obviously, you talked about the end milestones moving all in sync, but are you expecting start dates of activities to also move?
No, that's not the expectation. We think that we will be ready. Obviously, if the core capability providers are not ready on time, that will impact our ability to get through component integration testing on time, which could affect the start of SIT. That's obvious. We think that we will have enough, other than the core capability providers, we think that we'll have enough SIT volunteers to provide some contingency to keeping the date where it is. That we'll have enough to be able to constitute an MVC and start on time. So obviously we'll review that as and when we get up towards the 23rd of May, and we'll be monitoring that risk quite carefully. But assuming that the core capability providers are delivering as they say they will, we think that we should have enough MVC or SIT volunteers to manage that risk sufficiently to start it on time. So that's the assumption we're using at this point. But there are risks called out in the plan in relation to there not being enough MVC or enough volunteers for the MVC, as well as there being too many, because obviously the greater the number of participants in SIT, the more complex it is to manage. But that's more our problem than yours.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. James.
The plan, the artifacts on the document, including the plan and the plan, are they updated to reflect the CR?
Yes, the artifacts are all in line with the CR that's been published. I know that some participants tend to look at the slideware and the POAPs, and some others tend to look at the detailed artifacts. There's a couple of points that were raised where there might have been one or two very, very specific and detailed errors in the milestone log, but we are kind of, if you like, accumulating any feedback on the artifacts. But they're pretty heavy artifacts, so there's perfect. We can make them, but there might be one or two points that you pick up, and just let the PMO know. We'll make sure that we recognise any things that you do find in those artifacts, but they're all aligned to CR22, yeah. So they've all been updated.
Thank you. And in terms of individual services like meter operators and data services related, how will we understand what the impact on the timeline is for those individual things? Because obviously you've got your core timelines, but there are different dates we've been given when we've talked about pit reporting and start dates for those individual type services.
Yeah, if we want to talk about, okay, pit or sit start dates or.
So do you want me to pick that up, Keith? Because in the implementation approach slide deck, James, there is a slide in there that shows the dates for entry into the different CIT intervals, component integration test intervals, and relates that to the specific roles that we're expecting to come into SIT. So that does show explicitly. It is slide 18 in the implementation approach. That shows an expectation of when we expect the evidence for each role that's coming into SIT. For those participants who are not coming into SIT and are coming into qualification, in the detailed Microsoft project plan, whether it's the MPP or the Excel, we have included a set of preparatory activities that include the provision of pit evidence, that include connectivity testing, all the things we're doing with SIT as well. So there is a set of similar preparatory activities defined in the detailed plan for those parties who are going to come into qualification and not SIT as well. So the implementation approach is the starting point to look at the material, and then there's more detail on the activities in the actual MPP. Okay,
so there hasn't really been any movement on pit reporting execution dates from what I can see then.
No, I mean, as shown in the headlines, and as Keith said earlier on, we've largely been able to maintain our dates for M9 and for pit and component integration testing, because we've taken this new approach to staggered entry into SIT, and we've allowed for multiple drops from MPRS as well. So that's enabled us to maintain those key dates.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I thought you might add to that, Dom.
Yeah, just to add to that though, there has been some movement since round 3 in terms of the intervals. So in terms of pit readiness, that is aligned to the interval that you'll be joining under. And there is a slide in there that breaks down the pit artifacts as well, and kind of the target dates that we're looking for participants to align to based on the interval that you're joining CIT, if you are choosing to go down that route.
That's in that slide 18 I referenced in the implementation approach.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I don't have it open at the moment. There's 2 sections. Yeah, there's one in the SIT section that shows kind of general readiness for SIT, and then there's another slide in the pit section that looks at the actual pit artifacts as well.
Okay, thank you, guys. Right, Simon.
Hi. I was just wondering, because we're changing the timelines, etc., but you're not changing the M9 per se. Will there be any guidance on the phased approach through achieving the CIT entry point? And what I'm trying to say, I think, is if a participant is able to demonstrate, for example, capability to support CIT, would it still need to demonstrate the functional capability at the same deadline?
So I'll take this one. So at the moment, the PIC guidance as it stands is requesting participants to demonstrate that they have completed all of their functional DBT1 testing ahead of CIT. That said, in the SIT working group, we are looking at a couple of options to further break that down, but we haven't landed on that position yet. So one of the options we're looking at is breaking down the PIT DBT1 requirements in line with the SIT stage objectives. So breaking it down by potentially CIT and then functional. We've already split out migration. We're very likely to split out NFT and ops as well, so that you've got more time to complete those elements of your DBT1. But as I say, we're still considering the options on that, and there are further meetings that are being held with industry on that subject. There was a request in the SIT working group that if you wanted to be part of that discussion, if you could get in touch with the PMO by close of business yesterday. I think if you are interested, we could probably still accommodate that. So at the moment, the position is we expect all of the DBT1 functional testing to have been completed before CIT, but we are looking at options to maybe break that down further.
Could you give us any sort of steer as to when you may have made that decision?
So there's a number of meetings we'll probably need to take that through to get governance approval. The next session is really to play back the detail on the options that we're looking at. We need to consider the impacts across all SIT participants because there are implications to the options that we're taking. But we are looking to close out as soon as we can. But because it's quite a significant change, we will be taking it through SIT working group and likely TMAG for approval. So it will be over the next sort of 2 to 4 weeks, I think. But we are going to need to confirm that timeline.
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? Thank you for the ones we've had. We will we'll draw a line under the session then if there are not any last orders. Thanks for joining. Hopefully the kind of intro that we've given on the plan helps set your impact assessments in context, but please do reply to CR22. It's really important that we have a high level of engagement with industry and confidence that you have told us the impact on the plan and your support for it, so that we can move forward and manage this programme with a more credible baseline than the one that previously existed. So thank you very much for your time and have a good day. And we look forward to your CR22 replies. Thanks very much.
Thank you.